Hi there. Today we are going to talk about our last topic, the Reign of Terror. This is I don't want to say the fun part of the French Revolution because a lot of people died, but it's certainly the part of the French Revolution with which most people are familiar. The original goal of the French Revolution was to establish a French republic. They wanted they wanted to get rid of the monarchy and establish a constitutional republic that followed a constitution and had parliamentary procedure deciding its laws, as well as equal representation, because remember, the third estate was not equally represented in the estates general. So, this is going into the revolution, what they were trying to accomplish. So the slogan after the storming of the Bastille was liberty, égalité, and fraternité. Sorry, in French, liberté, égalité, and fraternité, which in my very poor French, in English means liberty, equality, and fraternity or brotherhood. You can see here in this seal on the right from back in the 18th century, it says liberty, equality, fraternity, or death. So this shows how very committed the members of the French Revolution were to this cause. So we had some different members of the French Revolution. The first was the sans-culottes. So the sans-culottes were the poor and working class members of the French Revolution. And the word sans-culotte literally means without knee breeches because wealthier people and aristocratic people would wear these short pants and tights, whereas the sans-culotte would wear long, normal pants. And then there's the Jacobins. So the Jacobins were also part of the revolution, but they were the bourgeoisie. So these were the middle class to upper middle class, more educated people, and they were influenced by the Enlightenment. So there was a bit of a divide here, even within the French Revolution, of some class conflict between the sans-culottes and the Jacobins. So after Louis XVI was overthrown and the monarchy was abolished, there was a division between the Jacobins and the pro-monarchy factions in the National Assembly. So even within the Jacobins, there was also a division into two groups, the Montagnards and the Girondins. So the Montagnards were the most radical of these three groups of the Loyalists, the Girondins, and the Montagnards. And so they actually sat leftmost in the parliament. This is where we get the term left wing. The Girondins were less radical. They were more the centrist party, and they sat in the middle of the National Assembly. And the Loyalists were ones who supported limited monarchy. So they supported the monarchy, but with more limitations. And they sat on the right, which is where we get the term right wing, because they were the most conservative. So the Montagnards, it was kind of cut off here, but the left of here was the Montagnards. Let me move this down so y'all can see. So this is Georges Danton, who was one of the leaders of the Montagnards, and the Montagnards said we should execute the king. We cannot trust any sort of limited monarchy. In fact, we can't even trust the king to live because then he'll get other countries to come and overthrow us. And the Girondins said we should spare the king. And this is Jacques-Pierre Brissot, there we go, who was the leader of the Girondins. And so the ones who won, as we already know, the king was executed. So the Montagnards won that argument. And King Louis XVI was executed. So this gets rid of the pro-monarchy aspect of the National Assembly. They've defeated those political rivals. Obviously, the Loyalists are not going to be tolerated in the National Assembly and are kicked out of the National Assembly because the Jacobins don't want any sort of pro-monarchy representation. So just to go over real quick, because I know I just threw a lot of terms and groups at you. We've got the sans-culottes, so these are the poor working class radicals. We've got the Jacobins, which are the bourgeois supporters of the revolution, the upper class educated. We've got the Girondins, which are the less radical Jacobins. They're the centrists. And we've got the Montagnards, which are the more radical Jacobins. They wanted to execute the king. So after the execution of Louis XVI, they entered a new phase of revolution. So external monarchies saw that this French people had not only overthrown the monarchy, but had also killed their king and queen and the royal family. And they started to get a little bit scared. They stopped just making fun of the French Revolution and started to feel legitimate fear over what that basically that their own people would see the French model and decide to overthrow them as well. So, monarchies outside of France formed a coalition and said that they were going to um, basically attack France to try to prevent other monarchies from being overthrown. So, the Girondins and the Montagnards started to turn against each other now that they had no loyalists to fight over in the National Assembly. They started to grapple for power. And the Montagnards wanted to focus on these attacks, these external threats, as well as internal threats, whereas the Girondins wanted to focus on spreading the spirit of revolution outside of France. And this is actually an argument that you see repeated again in the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. That's not really anything you need to know. It's just interesting. So the Committee of Public Safety is formed primarily by the Montagnards to protect France and the revolution. So this was originally run by Georges Danton, and then after he was executed, it was given to a man named Maximilien Robespierre. We'll talk about him in just a second. So the Committee of Public Safety was formed to protect France from external and internal threats. They passed legislature and kind of monitored activity in France and outside of France, as well as raising a French army to protect France. So this is the guy I just mentioned, Maximilien Robespierre. So Robespierre was the leader of the Committee of Public Safety. He was referred to as the incorruptible, meaning he had pure ideals that he stuck to, and he would not kind of give when it came to his understanding of morality. Robespierre wanted to create what he called a republic of virtue. So he wanted to create a French republic that was moral, that was, supported the common person, and that was virtuous. Robespierre took a note from Machiavelli. And even though he was against capital punishment, he said the ends justify the means. So Robespierre decided that it was necessary for the revolution to take extreme measures in order to avoid counter-revolution. And ironically, by taking those extreme measures, he probably brought counter-revolution on even more swiftly. So, what do we mean by extreme measures? Well, exactly what the French Revolution is famous for. If you've ever seen Les Miserables, you're aware of what that looks like. So now that the Montagnards have control of the Committee of Public Safety, and now that Robespierre, now that Robespierre is in command, the Girondins are going to be effectively wiped out in terms of political power. And thus begins the Reign of Terror. So the Reign of Terror was actually not even a complete year. A lot of people think of the worst, bloodiest part of the French Revolution as being the entirety of the French Revolution, but it was only a period of a few months from September 1793, goodness, to July 1794, which is essentially the period of time that Robespierre was in charge of the Committee of Public Safety. As we know, the guillotine was invented as a means of quote unquote humane execution. It was referred to as the national razor, and more than 15,000 people were executed by guillotine. And I suppose at the time, compared to being hanged or burned alive, the guillotine was a more humane way to be executed because you would die very quickly. However, interestingly enough, a lot of the French public complained about the guillotine because it was over too quickly. Public executions until even the 20th century were kind of a public spectacle. People would gather to come watch them. And so a lot of people were disappointed because the guillotine was over too fast. So that's just something to think about in terms of human history. So anyone who didn't submit to the will of the people would be executed. This is an idea that's rooted in the social contract. Remember, people give up some of their privileges to the government in exchange for protection of natural rights. And this is kind of taken to an extreme where if somebody doesn't submit to the general will, then they are against the revolution. So soon after, Robespierre started to become very paranoid, and so the National Assembly, under Robespierre's advisement as a part of the Committee of Public Safety, passed what was called the Law of Suspects. So the Law of Suspects stated that anyone who was suspected of being against the revolution could be arrested for questioning, and most of those people who were arrested for questioning were eventually executed. Um, this was heavily abused by Robespierre and his cohorts to arrest and execute their political enemies. And people started to see that this was happening, and Robespierre started to make a lot more enemies. So, this is a quote from Robespierre that really shows us his way of thinking. He said, "It is this virtuous people that spills all its blood to found the republic that is imposing to internal enemies and shakes the thrones of tyrants." So, what this quote basically means is that because our people are so virtuous, they are willing to die and spill their blood to create a republic that will crush people both inside and out who are against its ideals. So, Robespierre is pretty intense. Eventually, he was overthrown and executed in July of 1794, and most people consider this as the mark to the end of the Reign of Terror, because people saw how badly things got out of hand, and the National Assembly took over at this point from the Committee of Public Safety. So, looking at who was affected the most by the Reign of Terror, about 17,000 people were executed total. Not everyone was executed by the guillotine. A lot of people were executed um, to make an example of them, or in really graphic ways, in rural areas and things like that. The most of the people who were killed and executed during the Reign of Terror were actually from the Third Estate. You can see here that the working class, peasants, upper middle class, and lower middle class, those are all Third Estate. So it's about 85%, I think, of the executions during the Reign of Terror were actually enacted against the Third Estate. So this is kind of ironic, right? Because the French Revolution was started to benefit the Third Estate. And for whatever reason you want to argue, whether it's the Reign of Terror, whether it's just the French Revolution in general, it ended up being the Third Estate that was, excuse me, the most hurt by the French Revolution. It's hard to be exact about the death toll, because there were so many deaths, and extensive records weren't kept about these executions, because a lot of them were considered to be, traitors. One big part of the French Revolution that ultimately led to its downfall as well was was the de-Christianization of France. So, um, France was largely Catholic prior to the French Revolution, and a lot of Enlightenment thinkers saw Christianity, the church, and religion as a means of control because it had been used as a means of control with the Catholic Church for so long. They believed that the church had too much power, and that the church was controlling the lower classes, and kind of keeping them from making choices that benefited themselves. So they started to remove Christianity from the French state. They limited or didn't allow Christian worship. The calendar was changed, street names were changed, other names were changed so that they were no longer references to Christianity, and church lands were seized for state use. So, for a lot of people, this was kind of the last straw. They saw that the revolutionaries were taking away their right to worship. And a lot of the rural cities, so the country areas, they actually didn't support the revolution. Their lives were still difficult. They kind of saw it as a revolution for these smart rich guys, the bourgeoisie, who weren't actually doing anything to make their lives better, these rural people. And a lot of people did not approve of de-Christianization and were pretty mad about being oppressed when it came to their religion. So a lot of people, especially rural French citizens, started to form militias so that they could fight back against the massive revolutionary army. So the revolution eventually ended because it turned against all of its primary leaders. So all of these men who had fought in the beginning to start the revolution were ironically executed as a part of the revolution. Um, Eventually, political corruption weakened the National Assembly as it attempted to become more democratic. And since the National Assembly was weakened, France became ripe for takeover by a guy named Napoleon Bonaparte. And unfortunately, normally we would talk about Napoleon next, but as it is the end of the school year, we are going to be finishing with the Reign of Terror.